Here we go. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all as part of the Spherismon at Drisha, and welcome to the fourth session of Comparative Methodologies of Talmud Study with Rabbi Yonah Hain. Um, I'm going to be inviting everyone to join as a panelist. That way, you can share your face with us if you'd like, and you'll also be able to unmute yourself when we pause for questions. In between those pausing moments, you can put any questions you have into the chat here on Zoom or into the comments on Facebook Live, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Hain. That's all for me.
Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. It's good to see folks. I will go a step further than Maxine and strongly encourage those who are able to become panelists and those who are panelists to turn your computer on. It's greatly appreciated. So in previous weeks, we basically have painted a picture of two distinct methodologies. Right? The first essentializes what we read, is less concerned with the historical and more wants the takeaway. What's the message? What's the meaning? What's the driving, animating values at play? The other is rather focused on the historical. How did this text come to be? And we saw one of the key hermeneutics, one of the key moves within the academic historical method was trying to pin down what is the kernel of Tannaitic or Amoraic transmissions. What was the original teaching and what has been edited on or what has been cut off? And we're going to expand our understanding of both the yeshiva and the academic method today by studying a famous story in the Talmud, which ends with a lesson. And we're going to focus on that lesson. We're going to explore important issues such as the relationship between the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. And we're going to explore the fundamental question of what is the relationship between the narrative and legal components within the Talmud. So let's start with the chat for a moment. I encourage everyone to populate the chat. Pull up your chat box. What do you like better when you study Talmud? The law or the stories? You go to a class, someone is teaching. What's more enjoyable? The law or the stories? We have a nice mix here. We have a law, we have a stories, we have a law, we have a both, right? Sarah's trying to earn extra credit. We have a law here. Beautiful. Rachel says, I don't even believe in the binary. And then answers. Oh, okay, with the story. So I would love for us to take a few minutes to study the famous story of Dama ben Netina, a Gentile from Ashkelon, who is cited in the Talmuds as an individual with regards to the mitzvah of honoring one's parents. Raise your hand if you feel like you're familiar with that story.
Is it about the bird's nest?
Nope.
Okay, then I don't know.
Good. So we're going to, all right, Maxine, last check-in about breakout rooms. You think we're good? So do you have the source sheet?
Yes. I think
so let's put that in the chat.
Yeah.
What you'll see in the source sheet is that I have taken the source number 1, broken it down into its component parts, and separated it A through K. It'll make this story much more digestible. And I want you in our chavruta time to learn the story and then learn the halachic principle at the end and ask two questions. One, how does the story teach the principle? And two, what is the rationale behind the principle? The first one's a literary, more academic question. The second is a classic yeshiva question. What animates the principle? The principle, I'll tell you, is in halacha, it is greater to be obligated and perform a mitzvah than to do so without the obligation, which is somewhat counterintuitive, right? If you tell a child they must clean their room, but then they go ahead and take out the garbage, you might say, oh, that initiative shows a real commitment to our household chores. But the obligation within mitzvot is somehow critical. The halacha is a principle, gadol ha-mitzuveh v'yoseh, mishe'eno or mimi she'eno mitzuveh v'oseh. Greater is the one who is obligated and performs than one who is not obligated and performs. So our story is part of an expanded section in the Talmud within the first chapter of Kiddushin, the laws of betrothal and marriage, where we shift from conversations about marriage to conversations about other forms of status change. To be honest, it's other forms of acquisition. Does that reflect on that reflects on betrothal is an important question. And from there, it moves on to not forms of transition with other people and objects, but from a minor to an adult. And what are the responsibilities that parents have to the child as a minor? So in that conversation comes up, what are the responsibilities the child has to the parents? So the story begins, everyone following with me, Aleph, and fully read it by yourself in A if you'd like. Ba'u minei me Rav Ula. They asked Rav Ula. Who's they? Seemingly students, but we're unsure exactly. Ad heichan kibud av v'eim. How far does honoring one's parents go? Now, it's an interesting way to phrase the question because the way it's going to be answered is how far does one have to go in order to fulfill or in order to honor one's parents? You might have asked, you might have wondered, you might have answered the question in a different way. How far does honoring one's parents go? B. Amar lahem, so Ula answers, Tzu ura'u, go out and check. Ma'asa ove kochavim echad ba'ashkelon. Udama ben netina shmo. Why don't you go and see what this individual, Dama ben Netina, did, who's from Ashkelon? Now, we are reading a Talmud, a passage of Talmud. The Talmud is heavily edited. The Babylonian Talmud is heavily stylized. What do we make of this individual, Dama ben Netina? What about Ashkelon? Anything come up? What does Dama sound like?
So a Nateen is some sort of maybe Samaritan or some sort of non-Jew.
Justin,
And
excellent.
Dama,
Nateen, one second. Nateen might have a connotation like in the later chapters of Kiddushin, right? The Gibeonites and individuals who may be infiltrated, who had a mysterious status, a mixed status, maybe Jewish, maybe not. Excellent.
Dama is seems like characterized. This seems like some sort of a pseudonym in some way.
Yeah. What's the connotation? What if you had to take a guess? What would you think?
Seems like a non-Jew best of the non-Jews, something like
How so?
that. It just seems like some sort of a name that seems like paradigmatic.
I think it's blood, like
Ah,
Dom.
okay.
And almost like it's saying this is like a purebred hybrid, where, Nitin. And that's furthered by Ashkelon. Ashkelon is known to be a mixed city in the ancient rabbinic world. So we could be talking about here is already from the get-go, what is the status of this individual, right? From the onset, he's described as an Oved Kochavim, right? In some manuscripts, it's a goy. So this is a Gentile or an idol worshiper. But the name, and we're going to see some of the actions, might have a little merit to it. And now the question is, how far does honoring one's parents go? And Ula says, go check out this idol worshiper. Now, is this idol worshiper going to be an example of what to do or an example of what not to do? And that we have to use we have to keep our antennae up for that. So what's the story? C. Gimel. Yes, Sarah.
I was just going to say, it's an extreme example because idolatry is one of the sins that you are supposed to not commit. Like someone could kill you instead of you committing them, right?
Yeah, but not a Gentile.
Right, I know, but it's an extreme example for a Jew to hear a story about that.
Great point. Great point. And we're going to see that come around in Tet. Excellent. So Gimel, Pa'am achat bikshu chachamim prakmatia. So they were trying to buy some sort of merchandise, jewelry, b'shishim ribo schar, and it was going to cost 600,000. So they come to Dama, the son of Natina. So they were coming to purchase. Vaya mafteach munach tachat meroshotav shel aviv. And the key to get this prakmatia was found beneath his resting father's head. Velo tziara. And Dama ben Natina did not awaken him. Now, is this a paradigm of what to do or a paradigm of what not to do so far? Any indication?
Sounds good.
Why?
He's honoring his parent, doesn't want to disturb him when he's sleeping.
Lisa, let me ask you a question. Are you a parent?
I am not.
So you are a child of a parent.
I am.
Would that parent, whether they are with us or not, have wanted you to wake them up for a $600,000 profit?
Perhaps. I wasn't raised that way, but perhaps.
I would want my kid to wake me up for that. So it's not certain from this version of the story. Are we saying how far does one go? Go as far as Dama ben Natina or don't go that far? Let's see how the story continues. We are in Daled. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So now we have another version of it. Shalu et Rabbi Eliezer. Now Rabbi Eliezer is being asked. Ad heichan kibud aveim. Same question. Amar lahem, his reply. Turu ma'asa goy echad la'aviv. Look at what one Gentile did to or for or at their father. Right? I left that translation up. Right? Turu ma'asa goy echad la'aviv ba'ashkelon v'dama ben Natina shemo. Same person, same geographic location. Now the details are a little different. Bikshu mimenu chachamim. The sages came and asked to purchase avanim le'ephod b'shishim ribo schar, stones in order to make some of the priestly garments. And this would have resulted in a 600,000 profit. V'Rav Kahana matni b'shmonim ribo, and some say was even more. And that key was under Dad's resting head, below Tziaro. And Dama ben Netina did not wake him. Now, again, right now, is that good or bad? The story continues. And this, right, with our literary academic hats on, we must ask, is this now a continuation of both versions? Right? Part 2, DEF is just a parenthesis, but G is a continuation of both DEF and ABC? Or is part 2, DEF, continuing with G, and that G does not have any, ABC does not proceed with G? Did everyone understand that? Did the lettering help, or is that confusing? The postscript, does part 3 apply after part 1 and part 2, or just continuing for part 2? L'shana ha'acheret, Zion. Natana Kadosh Baruch Hu schara. God gave a reward. Shenolda lo para aduma bedro. That amongst his cattle, a red heifer was born. Red heifer, part of the para aduma ritual, very expensive. Nichnasu chachmei Yisrael etzlo. So the sages came to him. Amar lahem, he said to them, Yodeani bachem, I know of your culture. Shimani mevakesh mechem kol mamon shabaolam, that if I were to ask for all the money in the world, atem notinly, you would give it to me. I have all the leverage here. Ela ein ani mevakesh mechem, ela oto mamon she'efsadati b'shvil kvod Abba. But I am not going to ask you for anything beyond what I lost last year when I wasn't able to retrieve the jewels or the stones because I was honoring my father. Now, clearly, this postscript is saying it was a good thing that Dama didn't wake his parent, right? Because he receives a reward for it. Okay. Story over. What's the lesson?
I think there are a couple lessons. If they're part 1 and part 2 are a continuation, it means that he sticks to his ethics regardless of who asks him, whether it's the rabbis or the sages. You know, one might, if you know, your neighbor asks for something versus the president of the United States, for example, or maybe a movie star, you might, you know, naturally you might have a different reaction. But he doesn't.
Great.
So he does get this reward, but I'm on the fence about asking for so little. At first I thought it was honorable, but then it's saying that honoring his father cost him some pain, some loss of something. He didn't feel entirely satisfied with it. And so now he wants to recoup that money.
Interesting. I think there's another layer to ask. Again, how is the father going to react? You didn't wake me. We could have made 700,000. And then when they come and you have them over a barrel, you only ask for 700,000. So it's interesting, right? I certainly don't know if this story is being taught in any business classes. Maybe business ethics, maybe. Okay, what else? What else is a takeaway?
Well, I assume the jewels were his father's, but the red heifer is his.
It seems like they might have, again, how old is this person?
But the
How old
reward,
is this Dama ben Netina?
God gave him his reward. I'm assuming he's rewarding Dama, not his father.
They seem to be certainly in close proximity. He's answering when dad's asleep, so I wonder how separate the bank accounts are, but fair question, fair point, fair read. What else? Now, what's incredible is the Talmud is now a work where we transition from this narrative, segue right into a legal principle. And let's watch that pivot. We're going to look at the transition from the narrative to the legal. And we're going to ask, what's the relationship from the narrative to the legal, A, and B, we're going to ask, what is the essential rationale behind the legal here? Rachel, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I feel like you could read the story and not even think what you're asking. Like, well, would the father have really wanted the money, or, like it just as a story, the fact that he doesn't like extort the rabbis at the end, it seems exemplary. Like he's honest.
I agree.
Respecting his father, and he's also like a good guy. He's not taking advantage.
Totally.
Yeah.
But again, you're talking to an educator here. I am terrible with my money, as evidence of the fact that I'm an educator. So wouldn't someone say that market value for that red heifer is whatever you can get for it?
Sure. Yeah.
No,
I'm not saying it would be, I'm not necessarily saying I personally would think he was bad, but
I agree. The story in the postscript clearly, God is rewarding him. There's no two ways around it.
Yeah.
The question is, does that apply to the first version of the story? And there are layers here because there's a parallel with the Jerusalem Talmud.
Yeah.
All right, let's see the principled conclusion. Tet. The Amar Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina says, Uma mi she'eno mitzuve v'ose. And if this is what someone who is not obligated and does the mitzvah is like, kach mitzuve excuse me, uma mi she'eno mitzuve v'ose kach. Someone who is not obligated but does this, mitzuve v'ose alachat kama v'kama. How much more so someone who is obligated? And Rabbi Chanina said, and this is related about one who is not commanded and performs it, all the more so one who is commanded and performs it. Di Amar Rabbi Chanina, for Rabbi Chanina says, Gadol mitzuva v'yoseh mimi she'enu mitzuva v'yoseh. Gadol, greater, is the one who is obligated and performs, and the one who is not obligated. What's that pivot? Everyone understand Rabbi Chanina's principle? We're going to discuss the rationale, but that counterintuitive principle. You might think that it's greater if you're going above and beyond, but actually in the halachic system, greater is the one who is obligated. How is that connected to our story with Dama ben Netina?
So presumably he's not obligated.
Who's he?
Adama.
And therefore, what is Rabbi Chanina teaching?
Well, it's troublesome to me. He's saying that he's less than someone who is obligated, who performs the same thing because he did it voluntarily.
So Sarah's getting into, wait, what do we mean by gadol? Is this greater stature? Is this more reward? Right? What exactly does gadol mean? Right? Is there a hint of superiority in this text?
Mm-hmm.
But Rabbi Chanina is saying, if the Gentile who is not obligated is doing this, and it seems like a good thing, how much more so? What is strange about, anything strange to you about this Rabbi Chanina business here?
I think that there's maybe a second way to read it, which is not that
Please.
as Gentile, he's categorically not obligated, but perhaps we haven't really definitively decided whether the action itself was required. Maybe that's more than you need for honoring. And so he went above and beyond honoring.
Great. What about another answer? What if this was like a minor, right? Isn't that another way to look at it as a non-obligation case? Furthermore, are Gentiles not obligated in honoring their parents?
Yeah, I
according
was
to the
trying to remember the
halachic system.
Noahide laws, but I can't.
It's not one of the official ones, but
Okay.
you know, it could be an expansion of one of them. I find this pivot to be strange. Miriam, can you flesh that out? Oh, you're not currently a panelist, Miriam. You have been in the past. All right, we'll wait on that. I think it's a very awkward transition. What else makes this textually strange? Miriam, please flesh out what you were saying.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that was my bad. I came late. Sorry about that. I guess I was just saying that maybe, I'm not sure it resonates with me personally, my values or whatever, but I can see Rabbi Hain is saying that good, whatever that, what does good even mean? It
The
means,
gadol.
following God's mitzvahs. That gadol, exactly. And so somebody who's following God's mitzvahs, well, they're doing good. And if you're doing whatever you think is best, well, that's potentially a good thing, maybe. But it's
Good.
not the
So
same.
Miriam is bringing us into the next part of the discussion, which is what is the animating value system behind Rabbi Hanina's teaching? Let's get there. But I want to get back to what is the linkage between our story and Rabbi Hanina's teaching. So let's do the lomdus. Let's do the yeshiva, right? In the yeshiva, we essentialize. Forget whether this text, Rabbi Hanina is actually commenting on this story. Forget about the awkward pivot. Forget about understanding any of that. There's a principle. What's animating it? It's counterintuitive. You would have thought the extra credit without the obligation is better. So Miriam enters into the chat. Obedience. One way that the medievalists understood this, and this is going to be our hakira, right? Hakira, the different ways of understanding the same phenomenon. Are brachot pleases or thank yous? Right? Is Megillah reading on Purim about the despair or the redemption? Is it greater when one is obligated because you're not just performing the mitzvah, which you're doing whether you're obligated or not, but Miriam's saying there's also that quality of obedience, right? If you remember last week, we asked whether the purpose of warning was for the perpetrator in order to show intent, or whether part of the actionable offense is a murder that is rebellious and is a betrayal of God. Similarly here, perhaps what we're saying is that part of the beauty of a mitzvah is not just doing something good in the world, but is your obedience to God. That's one way. There are other ways. It might mean that you get more reward. It might mean that it's harder to accomplish. I don't know if this resonates with anyone. You invite me to something? Oh, that sounds great. I'd love to. Once it gets on my calendar and it becomes an obligation that I have to do, my resistance, my reactance says, I don't want to do that. Right? You invite me to a dinner in 3 weeks. Oh, it'll be fantastic. We'll go to Time and Tonic in Manhattan. We'll have a really nice time. I'm in. Then that night, I'm like, I don't want to go anywhere. Once there is an obligation, psychologically, we have more reactance. There is a greater urge not to go, not to perform. You not only have to do the mitzvah, you have to overcome that sense of not wanting to. Okay? There are some other reasons that put out Rav Lichtenstein from Har Etzion, right? A great 20th century and early 20th century Talmud scholar. He thought it was about the calling. You're a member who's answering a calling, right? It's not just about the performance. It's about belonging. It's a sense of responding to a call. You could theorize another idea, right? Maybe it's about and this might be similar to the reactance, but there's a consciousness, a religious identity of commanded, of obligated, right? In that sense, changes your religious disposition. So it's not just an act that you do, but you're doing it as someone who identifies as commanded. All of these are different rationales. All of these are perfectly fine explanations. All of these account for the same principle, but just different explanations for it. And we can go through halachic differences between them. I want to leave them for a moment. That's the lomdus. That's the analytic philosophy, right? That's the yeshiva style. What are the values animating this halachic principle? I want to go back to the historical for a minute. Let's look at the parallel and, to be honest, original version of this story as it appears in the Jerusalem Talmud. Source number 2. So you'll see it's ending. Rabbi Yossi bar Abun said, the following night, his Dama's cow gave birth to a red heifer, and Israel gave him its weight in gold and took it, the red heifer. Source number 2. Everyone with me? Now, this is where Rabbi Hanina comes in the Bavli. The Babylonian Talmud now has, right, post the Rabbi Hanina teaching. Here we have Rav Shabtai, right? Amar Rabbi Shabtai. Rabbi Shabtai said it is written in Job, and justice and much charity God will not suppress, right? Umishpat verov tzedakah lo ya'aneh. God won't ignore this abundance of goodness. The Holy One, blessed be, will not wait to give the reward for performance of commandments to the Gentiles. So what's the takeaway? Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu misha'ah matan scharan shel oseh mitzvot b'goyim. When Gentiles perform mitzvot, God won't wait to give their reward. Rabbi Hanina took the story and said, if that's what a Gentile does, imagine when someone who is obligated does it. But in the Jerusalem Talmud, it's going in the opposite direction. There's no pivot. Oh, if it was like that there, imagine. It just says this person is performing a mitzvah and gets reward. It's going in the opposite direction. I wrote this sentence out to get it right. You ready? Whereas the Babylonian editors categorized Dama ben Netina as not obligated but performing it, Rabbi Shabtai presumes that Dama ben Netina is doing mitzvot within the Gentile population. They are not contradictory, but they point in opposite directions. Rabbi Shabtai of the Jerusalem Talmud is putting Dama ben Netina in a category of mitzvah performance with immediate reward, whereas the editors in the Bavli are labeling him as the category of not obligated yet performing, and therefore less than in terms of reward or belonging or calling. It's fascinating. Whenever we're examining a text, exploring its parallels is essential to understanding its lineage. When trying to understand Rabbi Hanina, we want to understand the values animating it, which we've done. But we also want to understand what's the original context in which he made this statement. And if you read our story, you might say, well, the original location might very well be here. There's this story about a Gentile who performs mitzvot, and Rabbi Hanina contrasts that with someone who's obligated. But there's so many challenges. Can we look for a second? All right. Dama says, I could have asked for everything, but I only asked for what I lost. Now it transitions. Ve'amar Rabbi Hanina. Now, is Rabbi Hanina responding to this story, or is Rabbi Hanina being placed here by the editors? We don't know. Let's look for clues. So Rabbi Hanina has to do this pivot. Oh, if someone who wasn't obligated, how much more so someone who is? De Amar Rabbi Hanina. Friends, how weird is this? And Rabbi Hanina said, if this is related about one who is not commanded and performs all the more so, mitzuva v'yosa. As Rabbi Hanina said, is Rabbi Hanina quoting Rabbi Hanina? Now, some manuscripts see this as a problem, and some have only Rabbi Hanina in the second.
So
It's
it could be
the first one is when the sages heard this, they said, how much more so if one is obligated, as Rabbi Hanina taught. But what that starts to do is tell us that maybe Rabbi Hanina's original location and teaching was not this case. And so what we're left with is we have a text where Rabbi Hanina is cited, but its original one, Rabbi Shabtai, has a different message. And it's somewhat faulty, our text. It seems to quote Rabbi Hanina, quoting himself. And even Rabbi Hanina's placement here is a bit bizarre. So this gets into the question of the editors and narrative choices. There's a major scholarly debate. Are the editors the ones who are putting together stories? Or do the editors have what we call a tin ear when it comes to the stories? And I think in this case, they have a total tin ear. I think Dama ben Netina's story, as we see in the Yerushalmi, is not degrading his reward. It's such an awkward pivot to then say, Kal v'chomer, if you were obligated. Wait, this story is the wrong story to choose to teach Rabbi Hanina's principle. This is a case where someone who wasn't obligated received tremendous reward. Placing Rabbi Hanina here is very strange. So let's see some of the other contexts in which Rabbi Hanina comes up. 5:16. You know what? Actually, let's continue the story. Let's do Yud Aleph. Let's do part 5, Rav Yosef and he's blind, but might also apply to the visually impaired. Yud Aleph. Episode recap. In our yeshiva analysis, we discussed what is the nature of this halachic principle. Is it based off reward? There's more reward if you're obligated. There's more to overcome because of that sense of reactance when you're obligated. Maybe it's just about a calling. You're not just performing the mitzvah, but you're being obedient, or you're belonging to the category, to the people who are committed, right? You are identifying religiously as one who is obligated, and that's greater than just performing the mitzvah. From an academic lens, we're trying to understand, where does Rabbi Hanina's teaching come from? Is it native to this story? Did he teach his teaching based off this story? Or is that an editorial choice, and perhaps a bad editorial choice? In which case, we need to examine the other context of Rabbi Hanina, where his statement emerged, and see where things began and how they're applied to Kedushin, right? How they're applied to the Dama ben Netina story in Kedushin, and perhaps maybe without great success. Amar of Yosef, Yud Aleph. Let me share. Amar of Yosef, Marish, Hava Amina, Man Hava Amar Li Halacha Kerebi Yehuda, to Amar Suma Pater Min HaMitzvot, Avidna Yoma Tavala Rabbanan. Originally, Rav Yosef, who was blind, says, I would have thought that the person who tells me that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that a blind person is exempt from mitzvot, I would make for them a celebratory feast, right? A Yom Tava, a Yom Tov for the rabbis. Why? Lo mifkidna v'ha'avidna, because I wasn't obligated and I did it anyway. Rav Yosef, who was blind, is saying that I would have thought, he's demonstrating the counterintuitive nature of Rabbi Hanina's teaching. I would have thought that my opting in, doing mitzvot volitionally, was greater, and I'd make a Yom Tava l'Rabbanan if you told me that's the halacha. But hashta deshamita lahada amar Rabbi Hanina. But now that I've heard that which Rabbi Hanina says, gadol mitzuva v'yoseh yoter mimi she'ena mitzuva v'yoseh, that it's greater the one who is obligated. Adarabba, I would say the exact opposite. The one who would tell me that Rabbi Yehuda is wrong, and in fact, the blind person is obligated. Avida Yoma Tavala Rabbanan. For them, I would make a celebratory feast. This has no parallel in the Yerushalmi. What's Rav Yosef?
Sorry, I just want to quickly say that seems to be kind of a parallel to what Miriam put in the chat a little bit earlier about finding it tricky because of, the people who get to kind of define what, God's will is, have traditionally been men. Also, in this case, the majority are seeing. But yes, you can go on.
Personally
Sorry.
find it because Miriam, flesh that out. I hadn't seen that. I don't know when that came in.
Yeah, just like if we're talking, about the being obligated in the mitzvot, whether it's, for a nokri versus a yodi, or whether it's a seeing person versus somebody who cannot, it's the non-disabled, women who make the rules. And the reason, and this is just, a personal thing. The reason that it kind of doesn't resonate for me is because it feels like, as a result, not only can, people be what's the word, suffragized, whatever the word is. But in addition, it doesn't encourage people to go above and beyond, to find ways to come closer to God, even if you're not, Yehudi, or you're not a seeing person. So
great. So Miriam is
I'm not sure that it works in our benefit.
Miriam is raising multiple important points. One, there's a self-serving element, right? The class of rabbis that Rabbi Hanina, the class of people who Rabbi Hanina is elevating are those who belong to the class of rabbis, right? Men, able-bodied, Jewish lineage. But Miriam, what you're also bringing in, this is, in a drisha setting, as pluralistic as it is, everyone's going to have different mileage here as to how they see themselves vis-a-vis these categories, right? Do they see these as binding categories that define their legal religious practice? Do they see them as templates that have certain archaic elements that we have transcended and we know differently now, right? And where you find or don't find yourself within these discussions, Miriam, I want to validate that and also acknowledge that for some people, they might have a different calculation. I highly recommend for everyone, different gender identities. This certainly comes out with sexual orientations as well. I like Ilana Stein-Hain, my significant others, my spouse. Her 4 approaches to male privilege in the Jewish canon. It's a YouTube class. I think that covers a good range of, I'll hear certain women saying, I want to find myself in the rabbis, right? And others will say, I can't find myself. The chasm is too great. I can't just flip that switch, and the critical and essential to this conversation, Miriam. Thank you for bringing those up. Let's return now to Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef was saying, oh, I used to want the extra credit. Now it's better if I'm obligated.
But if Rabbi Yosef isn't obligated in anything, how's he going to get his reward in heaven or the world to come?
That's why he's saying, I hope that I am obligated.
Yeah, but someone has already said he's not. So,
well, there's a dispute. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that he's not obligated,
right.
And he used to hope that Rabbi Yehuda was right. Now he's hoping Rabbi Yehuda is wrong.
I see.
Because he wants to maximize Rabbi Hanina's principle.
Okay.
What's Rav Yosef doing here?
He's showing that Rabbi Hanina's interpretation doesn't fit everybody.
Interesting. Rachel, yeah?
I think it's at least complicating the entire story. Like, it's really just, I feel like it's definitely drawing our attention to this, who's in charge, like what you were saying about the rabbinical class and stuff, but it's at the very least, I don't know, it's so poignant that he can't make the decision for himself, and all he wants, like, I don't know, there's a lot. It's very, very rich.
Esther says it shows that Rabbi Hanina's view is accepted, but isn't it kind of also undermining Rabbi Hanina at the same time? And this is what I want to point out. In this sugya, in this passage, you have Dama ben Netina, which maybe supports Rabbi Hanina. I mean, you need a lot of finessing to say Dama ben Netina supports Rabbi Hanina. And then you have Rav Yosef, which also is Rav Yosef not performing the mitzvot. Rav Yosef is basically an exemplar of who cares whether you're obligated or not. You have to seek out your own religious identity, irrespective of how you are labeled, irrespective of how the system sees you. Carve out your own religious path. Whether Rabbi Hanina is right or not, whether Rabbi Yehuda is right or not, Rav Yosef is still showing up to do the mitzvot. I had a friend who called this Schrodinger's mitzvah. Rav Yosef, obligated and not obligated at the same time, doesn't matter. Performing the mitzvot. You flip that lever, is the cat alive or not? Both. The key is, are you showing up and being your best religious self? I actually think this passage, Esther, you're right. Technically, it's accepted, but it's completely undermined at the same time. So from a historical critical lens, we're seeing there's a complicated relationship between the legal and the narrative in the Talmud. Because while we have this legal principle that may be accepted, sure, it's the halakha, but we now have stories that undermine it. Dama ben Netina is a very hard stretch. The Yerushalmi certainly wouldn't make it. And Rav Yosef, irrespective of whether or not he's getting that extra reward, he's doing it. So what we see is that, again, just like last week, which I know was really hard for a lot of us, we were trying to understand whether or not that braita about a chaver, a knowledgeable person, not needing warning was an original Tanaitic transmission, or perhaps a function of the later intellectual Amoraic and editorial milieu. Here as well, is Rabbi Hanina's statement native to this story, or is it a later editorial gloss that puts him here? The literary evidence would indicate the latter. It's not in the parallel in the Jerusalem Talmud. it's not an obvious fit with the story that precedes it. And the story that follows it also seems to somewhat undermine it. So in an episode recap today, we learned a halachic principle. From a yeshiva standpoint, we analyzed what's the animating features behind it. Is it about reward? Is it about belonging, a calling? Is it about the obedience? And from a historical critical lens, we tried to understand what's the relationship between Talmudic narrative and Talmudic legal principles. And do the editors have a keen understanding of the folk tales that they're deploying? Or might they sometimes kind of miss the mark and make the wrong shidduch, right? They're matching mistakenly that which maybe means A, but they kind of shove it into B. Next week will be our last class. Next week, in addition to doing another passage of rabbinic literature where we analyze the yeshiva and academic methodology, I also want to take a step back and explore, so what do each of these mean from a sense of religiosity? What are we as the students challenged with and charged with when it comes to each of these methodologies? You know, sadly, most proponents of each denigrate the other. And I think there's religious value to each of them, in addition to having intellectual honesty associated with each to some extent.
First of all, I really enjoyed today. Thank you so much. And I was really intrigued by where you ended, and I don't really know how I feel about it. Part of me loved it, and part of me is like really uncomfortable, which is like great. It's just I like it. But so I guess so it sounds like you're saying, coming from my understanding, right, that Rabbi Yosef is saying, let's just sidestep this whole question of chiyuv, which is the part that was making me uncomfortable, because I had been the word I was like, we're disenfranchised, you know, by the rabbis. You know, I can't lead because I have no chiyuv, etc. So okay, and same thing for him, but you know, his not being cited. So okay. So he's like, well, so don't worry about you. Just do, you know, what's right. You know, respect your father, your elders, whatever, and you know, give a good sale and whatever it is. You know, do what's right and don't worry about it. So on the one hand, cool, it's still sourced in Torah, yet seems to avoid, you know, patriarchy. And also, the part that makes me uncomfortable is I feel like the whole point of following the mitzvah of halakha is to deepen your relationship with God, and chiyuv is the source of that relationship. Otherwise, you're just doing, you know, random stuff. So I don't know. Do you understand my problem?
Absolutely.
Do you have anything?
Absolutely.
I had the same reaction, actually, that if we're not, you know, the whole covenant is based on us following the mitzvot. The second paragraph of the Shema, for example, is all about if we follow the mitzvot, he will take care of us and we will have things to eat and drink. And if we don't, we're toast. And so that's the whole basis of our relationship with God, is through the mitzvot. Rabbi Scheinheld's book notwithstanding.
I think, well, he might source obligation and love, but not our conversation. I think this gets back to the mileage varying conversation. Where do we find ourselves in this tradition? Some will uphold the quote unquote traditional categorical identity-based frameworks. Others have long since left those frameworks behind. If we're working, Miriam, as you are, within some of those frameworks, now what you're saying raises a major question, because I want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to stick with the most traditional frameworks, more or less, but I also don't want to be complicit in a system of chauvinism and not just patriarchy, but just hierarchy. That's a real rock in a hard place. There, something has to give. And I want to be clear, I'm a big fan of living with tensions, and that the halakhic system is not just contorted to whatever our current preferences are. We can decide whether we feel obligated by it, but we need to be consistent in our interpretive hermeneutics. So if your first move is not, let's take Nashim. Let's take that category, Miriam, because that's what you brought up. Right? So there's the initial question. Do we see the category of women in Tanaitic literature as referring to contemporary females? Or no? Do we see that as a category that was referring to people who were not taught to read, right? They didn't have any financial independence. They were, treated as property. If your first move is to say, no, it refers to women today, then you're going to be in a very hard place when it comes to the covenantal notions of obligation, right? So maybe you say, okay, I still want to uphold some of those categories, but I think the covenant applies universally, right? And this is really getting into Ilana's 4 approaches, right? Male privilege in the Jewish canon. Others here, though, Miriam, and someone mentioned Shai Held, right? The Hadar Institute is predicated upon the notion that category of Nashim does not refer to women today. Similarly, interpreting, Vayikra 18:2, all of these moves. So the first move is whether you're upholding the old-fashioned categories. If you are, then you need it's hard. I mean, some people say there's a separate covenant, right? There's a covenant of non-time obligated mitzvot people. I think that's more apologetics. But now I'm already sort of imposing my first principle about whether or not the old categories need to be upheld. But if you do uphold it, obligation becomes very tricky. Yes, Maxine.
Yeah, I guess not a question, more of kind of like, what I'm thinking about around these categories, and specifically about how Rav Yehuda brings up this problem even without thinking about contemporary values and ideas about like personhood and obligation and all of that.
Kind of amazing, right?
It's great. No, I
Right?
really
Rav Yosef's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I really like the kind of Schrodinger's mitzvah kind of conception, but it seems to me like what Reb Yosef is kind of bringing to our attention is that like no one's until this like kind of story from Rabbi Hanina, he is going about his life as a sage and is like very much like participating in that community and culture, and people aren't like, he's not necessarily treated with an outlier, and that seems to presume, or people at least treat him as if he is obligated.
And all he wants is to belong to the rabbinic class.
Yeah.
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 He wants to make a feast to whomever welcomes him.
Yeah. But I think that, another thing is just kind of about the nature of law and how it relies on these like generalities or generalizations. And that's not necessarily how like humans work. So I think that, right, there is this general expectation that it's going to be a lot more difficult for a blind person to perform certain mitzvot, and therefore, like, it's not something that you can really say that, like, or that you can um believe that, like, God expects of them. Whereas with, like, Reb Yehuda, um, he's doing all these mitzvot, like, so you can assume that God does expect these things of him. And I think that there are some things about things that I've heard about, like, people saying that if you're a woman, you shouldn't daven Mariv like 3 nights in a row, or if you do, you should say Bli Neder, because, like, or else you're going to be like makavel on yourself, like the chiyuv to then daven Mariv every
Certainly,
night, and that might become
certainly,
difficult.
if that's true, she would be Mikabelet.
Yeah, exactly.
It's layers of erasure.
So yeah. So I think that there are, like, certain kind of ways in which, if that's true, then that means that there actually is, I think, like, room within halacha for people who are not in the category of chiyuv to, like, enter that category on an individual basis. So
All
yeah,
these are complicated.
it's
I hear what
yeah.
you're saying, and they're all complicated. And again, especially at a place like Drisha, we're gonna have people with drastically different starting points. And I think there's room for all of that. I think we should end. We're over by 10 minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and for sticking on. Really enjoyed the conversation and this year. Okay, have a good night.
Thanks.